Welcome to this week's edition of The Open Book with Amy and Tommy. I'm so glad that you've joined us again this week. We are in the 5th week of Lent as we journey together to the cross. Today, we're going to be looking at a scripture that may be familiar to many of you. We're going to look at it and listen to what God may be saying to us through this text so that we might live the life God is calling us to live. So, Amy, would you like to begin by reading the text for us today?
I'll be glad to. Our passage today is John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard and anointed Jesus's feet and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks to God.
So I think as we take a look at this passage, I think that it is worth noting that this story, or some version of it, is found in all 4 of the Gospels, and that is something that is unique, that we don't find often. And so for me, what that says is this was really a significant event. This really made an impact on Jesus and his followers, if it's one of the things they are all talking about. Now, what is interesting is in this passage, they're named. In many others, it's a woman or a sinful woman, and we don't know the identity of the woman. In some of the Gospels, it happens toward the end of the Gospel, and in others, it happens early on. So its placement and some of the details vary. And that also makes it tricky when we study a passage like this, because then we remember and we put in details from other versions, which I think is helpful and appropriate. But also, if we are doing a study on this text, for us to look into this text for the details. And I'll give an example, and Tommy, you can fill in. Before we started recording, Tommy was thinking about a particular phrase in the story and couldn't find it. And so then we went to the different stories until we found it. And so letting this story speak from John, but also then kind of partnering up and seeing what we can learn from the others as well.
Yeah, because John was one of the latest Gospels that was written, probably decades after the most previous Gospel. So I think the tradition probably got fleshed out a little bit more with names and what was happening and how this related to the almost second generation of Christians who were reading his Gospel. Because I was looking back at that phrase in Matthew's Gospel, which would have been a little bit earlier, which says that whenever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what this woman had done will be remembered. And so I think, interestingly enough, it's continued to be remembered decades later when John writes his Gospel. And I think you're also right that we need to stay true to to this scripture text in John and make sure we understand what's happening here.
Yeah.
So you were kind of talking about the family relationships in this text. Do you want to start out and just kind of think about who are the characters in this text?
Yeah. So Jesus's good friends, Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and they show up often and are some of the very, very few outside of the disciples of friends of Jesus who are named. So to my knowledge, we don't know when or how Jesus met this family, where their relationship began. Here's what we do know about Jesus. Jesus didn't have, as an adult, he was a traveler. He didn't have a home, and he traveled around healing, teaching, spending time with people, caring for people. And so every place he went, he was dependent on people in that town to open their homes for a place to stay and a place to eat. We see him throughout the Gospels multiple times in the home or with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And so this is one of several stories. And so I wonder and I'm curious about their relationship, because obviously there is a closeness for them to be mentioned by name in several Gospels. One interesting parallel that really jumped out to me as I was reading it today was the story of when Jesus went to visit Mary and Martha in the Gospel of Luke. In that story, Lazarus is not mentioned, but you'll remember this is the classic Mary and Martha story, and probably the first story most of us think about when we think about Mary and Martha. And Jesus comes to their home. Martha is prepping and working, and Mary is sitting at Jesus's feet. And Martha gets upset, and there's a whole exchange. And as we read this story, which is in a different gospel, so a different author, written at a different time, it was interesting to me to see Martha up and serving, and to see Mary again at the feet of Jesus. And so getting some insight into who these women are. And for the record, I bless both. I bless
Yeah.
both. Goodness gracious, we need Marthas.
And what's interesting in this family relationship dynamic to me, it appears that Mary and Martha are the head of the household.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that means. I've heard many wonder about what that could be. It could be, again, that Lazarus was not a person of great health. I mean, we see that he had died in the other passage, and it even mentions that here, that Jesus had raised him. So there's something maybe related to the health of Lazarus here. I've heard some interesting stories that Lazarus could have had a special need.
Oh.
And they were cared for by his sisters, but he was technically the head of the house, and the sisters were the ones who supported this. And that could have promoted this deep love Jesus had for those who are on the margins, the women, those on the special needs. That could have been what attracted Jesus to this family, and the family to Jesus themselves. I've always found that intriguing. I don't know that that's true at all, and no one knows. That was just, I've read some commentaries that kind of suggested that.
Well, that's an
Regardless,
interesting lens.
they have some money. They obviously have some money, because they're able to do a couple of things here. They have a home. These women have a home. Lazarus is there with them, and they're caring for him, or in some way. And then we see the costly perfume that's a part of this story today too. So I think we can look at them as someone of significant wealth who are also followers, disciples of Jesus. I'm sorry, I think I might have interrupted you.
Oh, no, I just was going to say that, that lens. And again, I love reading scripture with imagination and with possibility. And so that's such an, anyway, that was just, I hadn't heard that possibility before. And so that's just a really interesting read, and one that you can picture, and kind of as well, that would be a legitimate possibility that explains a lot, because it is interesting knowing that Jesus in many places, affirms and cares for women, but we just know culturally, women did not have a place of leadership, respect, authority, which is why there were no women disciples. And so it's interesting to figure out, well, why are they so prominent? And so that is an interesting, fascinating way to read that.
Yeah, because we know women followed Jesus, or had some,
Absolutely.
were disciples of Jesus in that terminology, but
Yes.
authors do not, that are
Yeah.
writing this story,
Yeah.
don't recognize that as oddly enough, they're showing Mary and Martha in this context in a very positive light, but
Yes.
they often don't
Yeah. And
push that.
to be clear, yeah, when I said disciples, I was talking about the
Yes,
literally 12 chosen,
the 12
not
children.
the
Yes,
wider follow, yes, because certainly Mary and Martha are disciples of Jesus and are very present and supportive and engaged,
there's so
and
many cultural
helpful in
expectations
his,
of what women could do and not do in that time, and
Mhm.
Jesus kind of transcended some of those.
Yes.
Even in the story you referenced in Luke, when Mary's sitting at his feet, he said she's doing the better thing, not
Mhm.
just so busy serving, even though the serving was necessary as well. As you said, we want to bless both of those personalities,
Yeah.
and how they love through their individual ways,
Mhm.
their love languages, for lack of a better word.
Yes. Yeah.
So, so let's look at a couple of this too. So they're having dinner for Jesus. As you mentioned, Mary serving, Lazarus is there at the table with them, and obviously other people, other disciples, because we hear that a little bit later that
Judas
that
is
Judas
there.
is there.
Mhm.
So Mary takes a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. The first thing I think of here is how messy this would have been.
Mm.
I mean, if you spill something, or if you take a whole thing of perfume and dump it on someone's feet,
Yeah.
that's it's not a controlled thing. It's not a, let me take your foot, let me just dip it with my finger, like we do
Right.
oil on the head.
Yeah.
We don't just dump oil on people's head. We just
Right.
do it very calmly so it doesn't make a mess. But this is not what's happening here. A couple of Wednesday nights ago, I can't remember when that was, but we had a service of healing here during our Vesper service, and we had healing oils. When I came in that morning to work bright and early, I walked through the office and I smelled
Mm.
the oils because they'd spilled a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then throughout the day, I just smelled the oil. And when we went into worship that evening on Wednesday night, we smelled the oil. It was a fragrance that just permeated the room.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't even take much.
Mm-hmm.
So this nard is something that's supposed to be invigorating,
Mm-hmm.
is how I heard it described. And I think that's I don't know. I don't know what that smell would have done to remind people throughout, even not just then, but over time, of what this meant.
Right. One of my favorite things to do with kids is to read scripture using our senses. And that's an interesting way to enter the text. And there are several stories, and this is one of them. What did people see? What did people hear? What did people smell? And so I love that. That brings another level of engagement as we read. And so I think, this practice and this question is something that we as adults can use as well, and just think about the sensory experience. Now, one of the ways one of the first things I go to in this text is, if you know me at all, you know how practical I am. I am very practical. And so seeing this and Judas's question about, now Judas's motivation was not pure or good.
According to the
But
text, yeah.
yeah, according to the text. but seeing the extravagance. This wasn't when we did the healing service in Lenten Vespers, the minister put a small amount of oil on their finger and a small amount in a cross on a forehead or on a hand. It wasn't pouring down. It was just enough. What Mary does is not just enough. What Mary does is everything that she has. And so that on one hand for me is very unfamiliar because I am just what we need
Right.
type of person in how I'm just practical about all the things, and yet have this deep appreciation for just the freedom and the lack of abandon she has in what she offers to Jesus in this moment. And it is not measured, and it is not contained, and it is whole, and it is complete, and it is not enough. It is everything. And so let's talk about extravagance and messiness.
Yeah.
As
Sometimes they go together. Yeah.
Sometimes they go together as we read this text, and as we think ourselves about how we live our faith and what we offer to Christ, to Jesus in our midst. Are we offering enough? Are we offering contained? Or is, when people look at us and our faith, do they also see extravagance?
Because we talk a lot about the difference between abundance and scarcity. And so we have a tendency to think scarcity, that there's only so much love we have to give. So we have to kind of reserve that for our family, then maybe our friends.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we have enough left over for all the people we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how Jesus, but we're kind of, my understanding is the more we let love flow through us, the more love we have to give.
Yeah.
And
I've heard I've heard this specifically from parents who have multiple children, that love multiplies and it doesn't divide.
right.
And with the more, with the more kids, with the more people we have in our lives to love, the greater potential and capacity and amount of love we have.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. And we have those in our situation. We can, and if we don't believe that to be true,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we become interior. We're not up for wasting the love. So we instead don't say it enough.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in a small group of men that have done Bible study on Thursdays or sometimes Wednesdays. And one of the things that I remember, it was a little bit pre-pandemic, I think, but we were meeting and one of them said, I want to be able to say, I love you to people in this group,
Mm-hmm.
which is, to have a bunch of guys saying, I love you at the end of a meeting that's awkward for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'll admit, the first time I thought about it, I was like, oh yeah, I do love you. I do care about you deeply. And yet I feel like I should reserve that for my wife and kids to say that. But I should. But I need to be able to express that love in other ways to other people. It doesn't have to be reserved for just those that I love in different ways. Even there are multiple ways to live love. Right.
So much of that goes into both in our story and in that of cultural expectations. What did we hear Judas's reaction, but who else was there and what was their reaction? And as we read this passage in other of the Gospels, we hear and see some of that. But one of the things that I don't think we see is any of the disciples saying, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think for everybody there is, this is such, and I think on a lot of levels, this is, here she is named. And so, perhaps this family was a family of means, but in others, it's painted that this was not a woman of means. And so
Yeah,
to
right.
give such a gift, why in the world would she do that? So, she could have done so many other things, why in the world? And so I just think about cultural expectations and how they keep us from expressing, living, our faith and relationships in certain ways.
So I wrote this down, and I don't know where it came from. My guess is part of it's me and part of it's somebody else I heard. But sometimes it takes something extravagant, audacious, even a little messy to move or to be loved into the future. It's never wasteful to love this much.
Mm.
And so thinking of the wastefulness of it all and how Jesus says, leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial.
Yeah.
So by offering it here, it's almost a loving Jesus into the future that is going to be a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like, I love you now and I will be with you even unto death.
Yeah.
And I need you to know that now, not just after you're gone. So sometimes I think I've been to a lot of funerals, and we hear such wonderful things said about people after their death. And I've wondered at times, is that how we said it when they were alive?
Right.
Did we?
Yeah. Did they know we thought that about them?
Did we love them so much?
That?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That we almost didn't need to say anything after they were dead, because everybody knew that we loved them purely and deeply.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that's happening here is Mary is loving Jesus into a future, saying that I love you so much now that you're with me now, because you always have the poor with you, but you don't always have me.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not don't care for the poor. This is not don't love the poor deeply. This is more of a Jesus is here in the moment. We love the person that's right in front of us.
Yeah.
And we also love those who are poor.
Yeah. And I want to spend a little bit of time with that sentence, kind of unpacking that.
Yes.
Because that to me, because I had to sit with that. And so I love your interpretation that you just shared, but trying to figure that out, because that seems counter to Jesus, who always was with and for the marginalized and those who had needs. And so for him to say to almost disregard them for his own sake, you'll always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me. But I do really love what you just said about, I don't know, and I'll say it a little bit differently. I don't know that Jesus was teaching about priorities in that sentence, but was teaching about presence. No. And so it wasn't about who is more important, but it was about being present in the moment, and knowing that, with so much of our lives, with so many phases, when we were in college, and for those of us who were married, when we were newlyweds, when those of us with kids, like, I just have this season for this time. And so, rather than like looking back to what was, rather than thinking or planning for what's ahead, just figuring out how to savor and enjoy and fully engage in this moment that God has given us, because these moments are all gifts from God. Do you have any other thoughts or things you would say about this sentence?
But
you've already
again, I
helped
think
me tremendously with it.
Yeah, I still think we're we're still in this abundant scarcity model, because there's a sense what's being said by Judas here is you can't be extravagant in your love and pour all this out on Jesus and care for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
You have to pick.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's how that happens. I think there's 5 loaves and bread can 5 loaves of bread and fishes can feed 5,000.
Mm-hmm.
It's not what we would expect. I think I was listening to Becca Stevens on a podcast recently. Becca is the founder of Thistle Farms, which works with women who have been trafficked and on the street, giving them a place to live, giving them a purpose and a job, giving them a chance to be healed through community. She was talking about how sometimes we have this bag of chips and we see somebody on the side of the road and we think, well, I could give it here, but there may be somebody else later that needs it even more. And so we hold on to it. And there may be somebody that needs it even more later. That may be true, but she was saying we give the chips to the person that needs it.
Right.
We don't worry about who needs it more.
Right.
And we trust that the Spirit will make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that person may have been hungry. It may have motivated them to get up and go do something, whatever. It could have led to a form of healing because they didn't have anybody they thought cared about them.
Right.
And we can see it in that moment instead of thinking about an abstract person in the future.
Yeah.
And so I think the healing part matters in this as well. Jesus needed it in the moment, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't take away from the poor.
Right.
We like to think it's an either or, but it's not an either or. It's a both and situation. If we give now, we can also give. It doesn't, I mean, maybe there are limited resources, but I believe that God can use whatever we have to make the difference if we're willing to give faithfully.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we're always going to have the option and the possibility of giving, but then we have certain moments, when I got this as you were talking about the Becca Stevens's, story or thoughts on if you have a bag of chips, share them. And, I just, then this picture came to my head. I mean, I just kind of took it further down the road. This picture came in my head of, we keep the bag of chips and then they expire, like, and
that's right.
And then what good are they? Because we've waited for the perfect moment, but there isn't the perfect moment. But, we give and we give again and we give again and all of the opportunities. And I think that's an extravagance that we are called to, is to continue to give and continue to see opportunities and to be open to responding to them. And again, like I said, with the, when we did the anointing with oil, we measured and we did just enough. It wasn't dripping down someone's face.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't stain the carpets. But I think, and so maybe my question for you and for us to consider is, what does it look like for us to live an extravagant faith? And I think we are so conditioned to, and particularly with this, we've talked about the scarcity mentality long before the pandemic. I think since the pandemic and through the pandemic, with food shortages and just with everything, and with energy depleting, we really feel that in profound ways. And so there is, there is this sense of holding back and using just enough and not, and there is less kind of freedomness and openness in what we share, both of our resources and of ourselves. And so my challenge is to maybe not think about being or doing or giving enough, and not being measured, but being fully present and offering fully what I have, which may or may not be enough or too much. What thoughts do you have on what it looks like to live?
Yeah, I have multiple things, because one of the things you mentioned, and it is something I struggle with too. We all struggle with during this time of exhaustion, of everybody, of not knowing how to give. And I keep coming back to my tendency is just to go turn on Netflix and watch something. I've said this before on this, and just zone out. David Stendhal Rast, who is a monk who I've read a lot, and he was in this conversation. I can't remember with whom, but he said something that has stuck with me forever. He said that the cure for exhaustion is not rest. The cure to exhaustion is wholeheartedness. And that stuck with me a little bit, is how do I live wholeheartedly, abundantly, extravagantly, not thinking I have limited things, but actually finding the things that matter to me, that bring life to me, and do those things, not the things that drain life out of me all the time, but the things that bring life. Thinking about what those things might be and living into those a little bit more. I think that's what's happening here with Mary. These are the things she didn't think about, what might be, what this could be used for. She thought about how she could gift Jesus in this moment. Also, I've heard a word recently that I thought was kind of fascinating, and that was the word guarantee. I think that was the word, guarantee. How do we guarantee this? How would we guarantee that this would be used for the poor? I don't know. We have a lot of desire to have guarantees, to be in control, to make sure that everything goes exactly like it should be. And when it doesn't, we don't know it. We just get stressed. But I was thinking the other day how if I had to think about the opposite of guarantee, the opposite of guarantee for me would be faith. It would be trust. So if I have to act in faith, act in trust, there's no guarantees. I just have to trust God and have faith in the one that holds us and loves us and knows us and moves us into a future that is so much better than our past.
Yeah. As you talked about guarantees, the word that popped in my head is certainty.
Certainty.
We don't, and the opposite of certainty is faith, being sure of and knowing. And there are things we can be sure of and we can know, but there's plenty that we can't. And that's where we have faith in our Creator who made us and loves us.
And I think we have to ask ourselves, do we actually care about the poor? Or are we just trying to maintain control?
Right.
I'm not saying we're trying to steal like maybe Judas was in this text, but we do like to maintain this sense of control. And I've been thinking a lot about our campus plan moving forward. And what is that? That's extravagant. It's audacious. It's messy. It's something that we don't have a lot of guarantees. We want to do the best we can to do the things we need to do. But I've had to ask myself a lot, how much am I willing to trust? How much do I know that no matter what the future holds, that, man, I'm going to use that phrase that I'm not sure I love it, but what the future holds, I know who holds the future. Right. And so if we are going to truly love into the future, we have to recognize that it's not going to be wasteful, no matter what happens in the next 10 years. Our call is to love. Our call is not to try to control it necessarily. We have some gifts that each of us brings to the table, but our call is to love. Yeah. If different people are in our neighborhood, we love them. There are things that I'm not sure I want too close to the church. And at the same time, if it were there, my call is still the same, to love them. Right. And so I think that's what Mary's kind of teaching us here. It doesn't have to make sense. Right. It doesn't have to be, oh, well, we could have used this for something else. It's how do we love the person that's right in front of us and continue to love into the future, because God's love is extravagant. Right. And and not measure or worry about if they're enough or how much of our love they have earned or deserve, but just to love freely and just to pour it all out and let it be what it is. And Mary was looked down on in this text. And Jesus says, leave her alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
He said that to Martha in the other text, leave her alone. She's doing what's good.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of times Jesus looks at those who are on the edges and says, leave them alone.
Yeah.
You're trying to be too spiritual. Here are people who are actually in the day-to-day using their senses. They're embodying faith, not just thinking about it in their head. They're embodying it through their actions of love.
Right. And I think that that's a good word for us to remember as well. It is not my job to judge or evaluate, critique, and measure how you are living your faith. It is not your job to judge, critique, measure, evaluate how I'm living my faith. And
I'm good at judging and
Jesus
critiquing.
stops the disciples when Judas, when he does that, no.
Yeah, I'm good at critiquing and judging, so I have to confess that
we
often.
all are. That's normal. And I think so much of that is proving that we are enough and proving our worthiness. And God does not need that from you, and God does not need that from me, because we are children of God, made in the image of God, beloved by God, no matter what.
So is everyone else.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we remember both of those things. I think it's important.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's good.
That seems like a good place to wrap up. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for joining us again this week. We are getting close to Easter. Is it next week? Is Palm Sunday already?
This week is Palm Sunday.
It is hard to believe we have made it close to the end of our Lenten season. So we look forward to coming back together as we prepare for our Easter celebration in 2 weeks. So thank you for being with us. We will see you in worship on Sunday, either in person or online. And then we'll be back here for Bible study again next week. Blessings to you.
Blessings to you. Peace.